My parents mocked me at dinner. Still taking the bus, huh? I stood up and smiled. Funny, my driver's been waiting outside in the Maybach for an hour. The table went silent as my sister whispered, Maybach? What Maybach? I, 32M, had been avoiding family dinners for almost 2 years, but my younger sister kept insisting I show up for Dad's birthday. She said it would mean a lot to him, that the family needed to be together, all the usual guilt trip lines that usually worked on me. I finally caved, though every instinct told me to stay home. The moment I walked into my parents' house that evening, I knew I'd made a mistake. My older brother was already there with his wife, both dressed like they were attending a country club event rather than a family dinner. My sister sat at the table looking uncomfortable, probably regretting that she'd convinced me to come. Mom was in the kitchen, and Dad occupied his usual spot at the head of the table, a glass of scotch already in his hand. I had taken the bus over, just like I'd been doing for the past few years. Not because I couldn't afford a car anymore, but because it was easier than explaining why I didn't drive the beat-up Honda I used to own. The truth was complicated, and my family had never been interested in complicated truths when simple judgments were so much easier. Dad saw me first and made that face, the one where his mouth turned down at the corners like he'd just tasted something spoiled. He asked if I'd taken the bus again, his tone dripping with disapproval. Before I could answer, my brother jumped in with a laugh, saying some things never changed. His wife smirked into her wine glass. I sat down and tried to ignore it. My sister shot me an apologetic look from across the table, but she didn't say anything. She never did. That was the family dynamic. Dad and my brother threw the punches. Mom enabled them with her silence, and my sister just watched, wringing her hands and feeling bad about it later. Dinner started, and for a few minutes, I thought maybe we'd get through the evening without too much drama. I should have known better. My brother started talking about his new promotion, something in middle management that he made sound like he'd just been appointed CEO. His wife chimed in about their upcoming vacation to the Maldives, making sure to mention the cost of their overwater bungalow. Mom cooed appropriately, asking questions and praising them like they'd just announced a Nobel Prize. Then Dad turned to me and asked what I'd been up to. I told him work was going well, keeping my answer vague. I'd learned years ago that details just gave them more ammunition. But Dad pressed. He wanted to know if I was still doing that computer thing, his tone suggesting I was fixing laptops at a strip mall kiosk instead of working in software development. I confirmed I was still in tech, and he nodded slowly, that disappointed look settling over his features like a familiar coat. My brother asked if I was still renting that studio apartment downtown. I said I was, and he exchanged a look with his wife. She mentioned they'd just closed on their second investment property, a condo they were going to rent out for passive income. My brother added that real estate was the real path to wealth, not whatever I was doing with computers. I cut into my steak and didn't respond. I'd stopped trying to defend myself years ago. They'd decided who I was in their minds, and nothing I said would change that narrative. But then Mom brought out the cake, and as we sang happy birthday to Dad, he made a speech. He thanked everyone for coming, talked about how proud he was of his children, and then his eyes landed on me. He said he hoped that one day I'd figure things out and find some real success, maybe settle down and start acting like an adult. He said it with a smile, like it was fatherly concern rather than a public humiliation. My brother laughed and raised his glass, adding that there was still hope for me, that maybe by the time I was 40, I'd have my life together. His wife giggled. Mom looked at me with pity. My sister stared at her plate. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't yell or throw anything. I just decided I was done. Done pretending their opinions mattered. Done shrinking myself to make them comfortable. Done hiding what I'd built because I knew they wouldn't believe it anyway. I set down my fork and pulled out my phone. I sent a quick message, then looked up at the table. Dad was watching me with irritation, probably annoyed that I was on my phone during his birthday dinner. I smiled at him, the first genuine smile I'd managed all evening. I told them I appreciated the concern about my bus-taking habits and my studio apartment. I said it was touching that they worried so much about my financial situation. Then I mentioned that I'd actually been meaning to tell them something, but I'd been waiting for the right moment. I figured Dad's birthday was as good a time as any. My brother asked what I was talking about, his tone already dismissive. I told him I'd sold my startup 6 months ago. The table went quiet. Dad asked what startup, like he'd never heard me mention it. I reminded him I'd told them about it 3 years ago, when I'd quit my corporate job to work on it full-time. He'd called me an idiot, and said I was throwing away my future. Mom asked how much I'd sold it for, her voice careful. I told her the number. 8 figures. Just north of 12 million after taxes, and splitting with my co-founder. Nobody spoke. My brother's wife's fork clattered against her plate. Dad just stared at me like I'd started speaking another language. My sister's mouth was hanging open. I kept going. I told them I'd been keeping a low profile because I didn't want things to change with the family. I wanted to see if anyone would actually be interested in my life without the money attached to it. The answer had been pretty clear. I mentioned I'd been living in the studio apartment because it was convenient and I'd been traveling a lot for work, but I'd actually bought a house last month. Nothing crazy, just a 4-bedroom place in a nice neighborhood with a good school district. Thinking ahead. My brother found his voice and asked why I was still taking the bus if I had all this money. I explained that I usually didn't. I had a driver now, actually. But tonight I'd told him to drop me off a few blocks away because I hadn't wanted to deal with questions. Speaking of which, I added, he'd been waiting outside for about an hour now, and I should probably head out. Dad asked what kind of car my driver was in, his tone strange. I told him it was a Maybach, and before anyone could respond, my phone buzzed. My driver was confirming he was out front like I'd requested in my message a few minutes ago. I stood up and thanked Mom for dinner. I told Dad happy birthday. I looked at my brother and his wife and said their investment properties sounded great, really impressive. The sarcasm wasn't even subtle, but I was past caring. My sister whispered something about a Maybach, asking what Maybach, like she hadn't heard me correctly. I told her she should come see it sometime. I'd be happy to give her a ride, maybe take her to lunch somewhere nice. Just her, though? She nodded, still looking shell-shocked. I walked toward the door, and Dad finally reacted. He stood up and demanded to know why I hadn't told them earlier, why I'd let them think I was struggling. His face was red, and I couldn't tell if it was embarrassment or anger or both. I turned back and told him the truth. I said I'd wanted to see if anyone would ask about my life because they cared, not because they wanted to judge or compare. I'd wanted one dinner where someone asked how I was doing and actually listened to the answer. Instead, every gathering for the past 3 years had been an opportunity for them to remind me that I was the family disappointment. Mom started crying, saying she'd always cared. I told her that caring meant more than pity. It meant believing in me, or at least giving me the benefit of the doubt. It meant defending me when Dad and my brother turned every dinner into a roast session with me as the main course. My brother tried to backtrack, saying they'd just been joking around, that I was too sensitive. I asked him if he'd find it funny if I spent every family dinner making fun of his mediocre middle management job and his basic suburban lifestyle. I asked him if his wife would laugh if I mocked her tacky designer knockoff purse and her try-hard social climbing. His face went white. I told them all that I was done. Done with the judgment. Done with the comparisons. Done with being the punchline. I said they could reach out when they were ready to have an actual relationship based on respect rather than their need to feel superior. Until then, I had better things to do with my time. I left and got in the Maybach. My driver asked if everything was okay, probably noticing my tense expression. I told him it was fine, just family stuff, and asked him to take me home. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and dozens of texts. My brother had sent a long message about how I'd embarrassed everyone and ruined Dad's birthday. Mom had left weepy voicemails asking me to come back so we could talk. Dad had sent a brief text saying we needed to have a conversation about my attitude. The only message I responded to was from my sister. She'd asked if I was serious about lunch. I told her I was, and we made plans for that weekend. Update 1. The lunch with my sister happened 3 days after the dinner disaster. I picked her up in the Maybach, and I wish I could have captured the look on her face when she realized I hadn't been exaggerating. She climbed in carefully, like she was afraid to touch anything, and we headed to a restaurant I'd been meaning to try. At first, she didn't know what to say. She kept looking around the car, then at me, then back at the car. Finally, she asked why I'd never told her about any of this. I reminded her that I had tried, multiple times over the years. Every time I'd mentioned my startup or my work, she nodded politely, but never asked follow-up questions. She'd been present for every dinner where Dad and our brother had mocked me, and she'd never once spoken up. She started crying then, admitting she'd been a coward. She said she'd always taken the path of least resistance, never wanting to rock the boat or cause conflict. She'd told herself that staying silent was neutral, but she understood now that silence was a choice too. She'd chosen their comfort over my dignity every single time. I appreciated the honesty, but I told her that understanding what she'd done was just the first step. The question was what she planned to do differently going forward. She promised she'd do better, that she'd stand up for me, but I'd heard promises before. I told her I needed to see it, not just hear it. We had a good lunch after that. She asked real questions about my company, about what I'd built and how I'd done it. She seemed genuinely interested, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to my actual sister rather than a stranger who happened to share my DNA. She told me that things at home had been tense since the dinner. Dad was furious, not at himself, but at me for making him look bad. My brother had been calling her constantly, trying to get information about my finances and whether I was really as successful as I'd claimed. Mom kept oscillating between guilt and defensiveness, sometimes admitting they'd treated me poorly, other times insisting I was being overdramatic. My sister asked what I wanted from them. I told her the truth. I wanted an actual apology, not the non-apology version where they were sorry I felt bad but didn't acknowledge what they'd done wrong. I wanted them to understand that you don't get to spend years belittling someone and then act shocked when that person finally walks away. And most importantly, I wanted them to actually change how they treated me, not just fake it for a few months before slipping back into old patterns. She asked if I thought that was possible. I said I honestly didn't know. Update 2. A week after my lunch with my sister, Dad showed up at my new house. I'd been unpacking boxes in the living room when the doorbell rang. I checked the camera and saw him standing there, looking older and smaller than I remembered. For a moment, I considered not answering, but curiosity won out. I opened the door and asked what he wanted. He said we needed to talk, that this whole situation had gone too far. I stepped aside and let him in, more interested in what he'd say than in maintaining my boundary. He walked through the foyer, taking in the high ceilings and the artwork I'd just had hung. He looked at everything with this expression I couldn't quite read, something between confusion and resentment. We sat in the living room, and I waited for him to speak. He started by saying he'd never meant to hurt me. He claimed the comments at dinner were just jokes, the kind of ribbing that families do. He said I'd always been too sensitive, that I took everything too personally. He suggested that maybe if I'd lightened up and laughed along, I wouldn't have felt so attacked. I asked him if he seriously came all the way to my house just to tell me that the problem was my reaction to being disrespected, not the disrespect itself. He got defensive, saying he was trying to make peace, but I wasn't making it easy. I told him that peace without accountability was just a demand for me to shut up and accept poor treatment. He shifted tactics then, asking why I'd hidden my success from the family. He wanted to know why I'd lied about my circumstances. I corrected him. I hadn't lied. I'd simply stopped sharing details after it became clear that nobody was interested unless those details fit their predetermined narrative of me as a failure. I'd given them years of opportunities to ask genuine questions, and they'd chosen mockery instead. Dad said that if I'd just told them about the money, things would have been different. That's when I realized he still didn't get it. I told him that was exactly the problem. He was saying their respect was conditional on my financial success, that I was only worth treating well if I could prove I'd made it by their definition. I asked him if he understood how messed up that was. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked around the house again and asked how much I'd paid for it. I told him it wasn't relevant. He pressed, and I finally said I'd paid cash, no mortgage. His face did something complicated, and I understood that he was struggling with the fact that his disappointing son had just surpassed him in every material measure he valued. I asked him directly what he wanted from this conversation. He said he wanted things to go back to normal, for the family to be whole again. I asked him what normal meant to him, whether it included him and my brother using me as a verbal punching bag while everyone else watched. He claimed they'd never done that I was exaggerating and holding grudges. That's when I told him to leave. I said I'd given him a chance to take real accountability, to acknowledge specific things he'd said and done, and to commit to actual change. Instead, he'd come here to gaslight me, to rewrite history, and to make his discomfort my responsibility. I told him I wasn't interested in a relationship on those terms, and until he was ready to have an honest conversation, we didn't have anything else to discuss. He stood up, angry now, and said I was being childish and vindictive. He claimed I was punishing the whole family over nothing, that I was using my money to feel superior. I walked him to the door and told him that was projection. I said I'd spent my entire adult life trying to earn his approval while he'd spent that same time making clear I never would. Now that I'd stopped caring about his approval, He was angry because he'd lost his favorite target. He left without another word, and I watched through the window as he got in his car and sat there for a few minutes before driving away. I felt something release in my chest, some last hope that he might surprise me. He hadn't, and now I knew for certain what I was dealing with. Update 3. 2 months passed without any contact from my parents or brother. My sister and I had been meeting for lunch regularly, and I could see her trying to process years of family dysfunction she'd previously ignored. She told me that Mom was struggling, that Dad refused to talk about what happened at my house, and that my brother was telling anyone who would listen that I'd fabricated my success and the Maybach was probably rented. Then my sister called me one evening, her voice tight with stress. She said our parents were planning a family intervention, that they wanted everyone to sit down and hash things out. She'd been instructed to get me there under false pretenses, maybe by saying she needed my help with something. She was calling to warn me instead, to ask what I wanted her to do. I told her to tell them the truth, that she'd warned me, and that I wasn't interested in an ambush disguised as reconciliation. I said if they wanted to talk, they could reach out directly like adults, apologize for specific actions, and ask if I'd be willing to meet. The answer would probably still be no, but at least it would be honest communication. She hesitated, saying that would cause a huge fight. I reminded her of our lunch conversation, about how silence was a choice. I told her this was her opportunity to actually stand up for me instead of just promising to do so. She was quiet for a long moment, then said she'd tell them. Apparently, that conversation went about as well as expected. My parents were furious that my sister had warned me. My brother called her a traitor. Mom cried and said the family was falling apart. My sister held firm, telling them that if the family was falling apart, it was because of how they'd treated me for years, not because I'd finally had enough. That earned her some of the treatment I'd been getting. Suddenly, she was too sensitive, too influenced by me, not seeing things clearly. My brother suggested she was only defending me because she wanted access to my money. Dad told her she was being manipulated. My sister called me after that fight, shaken but also strangely energized. She said she'd never stood up to them before, and now she understood why I'd needed distance. She said watching them turn on her the moment she disagreed with them had been enlightening. She apologized again, more specifically this time, for every dinner she'd sat through in silence, for every time she'd chosen her own comfort over my dignity. I told her I forgave her, and I meant it. Growth is messy, and she was doing the work. Things settled into a new pattern after that. My sister and I grew closer. My parents and brother remained distant, occasionally sending messages that ranged from angry to manipulative to self-pitying. I didn't respond. I'd said what I needed to say, set the boundaries I needed to set, and now I was just living my life. The best revenge, I discovered, wasn't the money or the car or the house. It wasn't even the satisfaction of proving them wrong. The best revenge was building a life I didn't need revenge for, a life that wasn't defined by their opinions or diminished by their judgment. The best revenge was realizing I didn't need them to understand or approve or change. The best revenge was being genuinely, completely fine without them. I still take the bus sometimes, when it's convenient. My driver thinks it's funny. My sister does too. And that's enough.